RFK begins his all-out assault on biomedical research. This is America Dissected. I'm your host, Dr. Abdul
And I'm your co-host, Dr. Katelyn Jetelina.
And we're recording this on Tuesday, May 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Katelyn, happy Mother's Day to you this weekend.
Thank you. And same to your wife. What are you guys going to be doing?
Well, I need to figure that out.
Please tell me you have plans.
I have plans. I just don't know if they are yet. I will
That's
update
okay.
you.
You have a few days.
I will update you next week as to what our plans were and how well I executed on them. To be fair, I've been otherwise indisposed.
Such a guy.
I have excuses.
Such a guy.
No, I mean, usually what we end up doing is making a breakfast in bed. And I think what I'm going to try and do is probably like take the girls out of the house for a while and then let Sarah have like some time away, some like peace and quiet. Like we have a 2-year-old, and so she just can't seem to leave Sarah alone. There's like this clinginess that I feel for. And so I think the best thing is, funnily enough, like my 2-year-old understands that Costco is the best corporation. Like it's the only one worth defending. And so she just really likes to go to Costco. So I may just take the girls to Costco, and while we're there, you know, as a Costco dad, I may find some like weirdly cheap Chinese goods before the tariffs kick in, and see how many of them I can buy for my wife. Maybe that's the plan. I think we just made it up in real time.
Okay, good. It sounds like a good plan. And yeah, Costco, I cannot leave Costco without paying less than like $300 in my cart. My girls love it too.
One of my favorites are like millennial themed memes is they're like walking into Costco and they're like about to drop $500 in the club.
Yeah. Yes. What's wrong with that?
I mean, you know, important household items, half of which you will use. And on that consumerist note, let's jump in. So, you know, it's been quite a week when it comes to the, you know, fundamentals of biomedical research, Katelyn. And I want to start here with RFK Jr.'s announcement that he wants all new vaccines to be tested against placebo. So, Katelyn, if you can give us a sense of like, what does this mean? Because I think for a lot of folks listening out there, they're like, wait, aren't they all tested against placebo anyway? So I think it'd be worth just sort of sharing how we think through how to test vaccines and why.
Yeah, I mean, I think first off, I just want to level set that a lot of these are talking points that he's saying, and none of it's like actual policy yet. So let me just get into why we use different platforms and why RFK really can't do anything about this right now. So a lot of our vaccines are tested against placebos, like saline, for example. When we have a brand new pathogen, so COVID-19 or RSV vaccines, this is really important in evaluating safety and efficacy. However, this is where the kernel of truth comes in, is that some vaccines haven't been tested against a placebo, but rather against another vaccine. Scientists do this when they, one, combine vaccines, so our kids get pricked less, to change strains like we do with COVID or flu every year, or develop a next generation vaccine. And these are not placebo tested. They're called bridge studies, which basically allow scientists to see if this new vaccine or a drug is as good or better than that original vaccine that went through this placebo clinical trial. If it's not as good or better, it just doesn't go to market. And so how I envision this is like building blocks, right? Advancing from this foundation rooted in randomized placebo trials, and then advancing incrementally on top of that strong foundation. There's 2 reasons why we do this way. One is ethics, right? We cannot withhold known protection. In other words, we cannot just give someone a placebo vaccine if they volunteered for a clinical trial, if there's already a better alternative than getting the disease in the first place. I like to compare this to, for example, car seats, right? If we're testing a better car seat, we're not going to get half the kids no car seat at all, because we know that that's just not safe. It's just not ethical for scientists and physicians to do. And then the second is feasibility, right? Some vaccines like flu are updated yearly to match the circulating strains. And these are just very small tweaks. They're not new full products. And we just don't have time for a randomized control study because the virus just mutates too quickly. And so that's where we're landing with placebo-controlled vaccines and drugs. And I really don't think RFK can do much in this space. I mean, this is already really top-notch research. And yeah, it's not clear what he wants to do with this. What are your thoughts, Abdul?
I think about it like, when you think about like a rule of thumb, right? You're like, okay, so if you measure your fist, for example, relative to a ruler, you kind of know how many inches your fist are. And then let's say you don't have a ruler on you, right? And you're out in the wild and you say, okay, how many fist lengths are this thing? You've still assessed a certain thing relative to the gold standard, and then you're now assessing that thing that you assess relative to the gold standard relative to whatever else you want to measure against. And so, to your point about being able to have established a placebo baseline, it's just a more efficient way to go about doing research. And it's interesting, right? Because the whole idea of Doge is efficiency. And these trials are just way more efficient when you are assessing the performance of a vaccine relative to a vaccine that people are already out there taking because that vaccine was tested relative to placebo. So when we rolled out the COVID-19 vaccine, to your point, it's not like they didn't test it relative to placebo. Of course, they had to test it relative to placebo. But now you're testing new versions of the vaccine. You're not going to test it relative to placebo. You're going to test it relative to the old version of the vaccine because you already know how the old version of the vaccine does relative to placebo. So we do this kind of logic all the time. But the implicit goal here is to undermine a lot of the fundamental studies. It's hard not to see it that way, right? Because when you start raising this point of saying, well, we haven't tested them relative to placebo, what you're trying to do is create a argument against that vaccine that undercuts relative support for those vaccines. And scientifically, like we've identified, there are a lot of really, really smart epidemiologists and study design folk who have thought through how you think about these tests relative to vaccines that are already in the field. And so this is entirely about trying to undermine support for vaccines more generally in a way where you can use a rhetorical argument that doesn't really stand the test of science. But then again, a lot of the things that we're seeing out of this RFK-based HHS has never really been about standing the test of science.
Yeah, I would just say, this is not a new falsehood or rumor. That, I mean, this placebo-based talking point, it has been used for decades among disinformation groups. And you're right. So you're right. It is. I would assume the purpose is to start sowing doubt in vaccines. It all kind of made. I was curious why it started bubbling up last week, Abdul. And I think it all kind of made sense today on Tuesday. Vinay Prasad has been named to replace Peter Marks at the FDA, which means he'll be in charge of vaccines and medications. And one thing Dr. Prasad has always talked about is the need for a placebo randomized control trial. So, for example, he called for a lot about this with masks during the pandemic. So I guess all of the placebo talk last week was a precursor to what was coming this week.
And just for folks who don't know who Vinay Prasad is, here is a quick sample of what he's had to say.
What would the world look like without the FDA? That's the question you pose. And I think you're absolutely right. I think people talk about as if it will be a free-for-all. There'll just be tons of products coming on the market and we won't know what's better. In many ways, it might be like the way the cellular phone market is. There's still fierce competition. There's a number of websites that are rating phones all the time. When you're thinking about buying a phone, particularly an Android phone, all these sites are rating them. There may be different groups of people who rate cancer drugs differently. I think I'm a very sort of a purist of evidence-based medicine. We would put out, we could arguably put out a set of guidelines. Some insurance companies may decide to go with me because they think, Prasad's guidelines are more evidence-based. They lead to more cost-effective healthcare. Other insurance companies might go with different guidelines, but you would get competition in the marketplace.
For folks who don't know who Dr. Prasad is, this is probably a person who can be best described as being like a professional medical iconoclast. He, up until now, has mainly existed on YouTube, and he has legitimate scientific credentials, but he is probably about as iconoclastic as it gets. And this is somebody who generally has constantly questioned scientific consensus, and he's made a whole living out of it. So, this is in keeping with the kinds of folks that this administration has appointed to extremely powerful positions in public health. And I don't think that's going to make us much safer.
Right. He's the perfect guy for giving this intellectual pretext for placebo-controlled RCTs for everything. It'll be really interesting to see how this plays out. But in the same announcement, there's more, Abdul, that Kennedy said he wants to do away with vaccines that use mRNA technology. And we're actually seeing this play out on a state level as well. What's going on there?
This is bowing to my mind. So let's just, for folks who don't pay much attention to this, mRNA technology is about using messenger RNA to get our own bodies to make the proteins that we're trying to create immune responses to. It's an efficient way to do this because mRNA has a number of advantages relative to just protein and or live virus or attenuated virus or dead virus, which is what we've used for vaccine technology in the past. mRNA's big challenge is that it has created a space where people who want to deliberately disinform the public have used the relationship between mRNA and DNA to make an argument that somehow mRNA is going to change your genetics, which is fundamentally untrue. So just to explain what mRNA is relative to DNA, imagine if your DNA is the Bible, right? And you wanted to take a picture of a page in the Bible so you could share it with others so that they could read it or pay attention to it. You would take that picture, and the body's version of taking a picture out of the Bible is making mRNA out of DNA, right? DNA is held in the nucleus of cells. We know it's famously held in a double helix. That double helix comes apart, and then there are structures in the nucleus that will read that DNA and turn it into mRNA. The mRNA leaves the nucleus, and then your body will turn it into different kinds of protein. So the way that mRNA vaccines work is to just take the DNA of a virus, use it to make mRNA, and then introduce that mRNA into the body, and then your body will make the proteins to which it will then form an immune response. But mRNA can't get back-coded into DNA. That's just not how our bodies work. And so this idea that because you use genetic material that you're messing around with human genes is just not true. But people have leveraged a poor understanding of our genetics into the information space to make people believe that somehow mRNA is going to mess around with DNA. And that's just not true. And it's also a really, really dangerous talking point. And I think this is bowing to that talking point, again, with the broader goal here to try and cast aspersions more broadly on what has been a really effective piece of technology. And the other point I just want folks to understand, mRNA vaccines are so powerful because they allow you to use the genetic information of a virus to turn it into a vaccine quickly, right? And that's why they're so powerful. That's why we were able to render a COVID vaccine in less than a year. And so taking this off the table, I worry, sets us up in a really, really bad position should the next virus emerge. Katelyn, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, and this is not just happening at a federal level, right? Wiley, my newsletter, I talked about this today, Tuesday, is that this is actually happening on a state level as well, is that there's several state level bills considering to restrict or even criminalize the use of mRNA vaccines. So Iowa providers could face fines up to $500 for administering mRNA vaccines. This was approved by their Senate subcommittee. Idaho wants to ban mRNA vaccines for 10 years. Montana considered a similar bill, but it was actually defeated in the House because two Republicans stepped up saying no. Minnesota, there was a bill to label mRNA vaccines as weapons of mass destruction. And so these bills all build upon all these false claims that mRNA technology, like you just said, Abdul, is gene editing. And it's just a falsehood that we have been debunking since 2020. I mean, this just keeps going and going. And I do want to also highlight that mRNA vaccines are not just good for COVID, right? This technology is revolutionizing treatments for cancer and allergies, for example. One that I have been paying really close attention to is pancreatic cancer. The early clinical trials of mRNA vaccines for pancreatic cancer, right? Pancreatic cancer, the overall survival rate's about 10%. It's a terrible diagnosis to get. But this early clinical trial, which was a phase 1, increased survival rate to 50% using an mRNA vaccine. We're also seeing this with a kidney cancer in a phase 1 trial as well, which is basically showing the kidney cancer is curable with this sort of vaccine. Of course, we need to do much bigger trials. There's a lot for us to understand, but it has the potential to transform some of these outcomes that are really hard to treat. And cutting off this technology or even just sowing doubt is just devastating to the future of biomedicine. Like, I don't know how else to say it.
It's a crazy thing also because it's just such a sign of the times, right? Is that
Yeah,
you
it
have a
is.
few circus clowns who, based on a fundamental failure to understand the basic science they're talking about, can confuse the public. And then that public demands a thing that makes absolutely zero sense. That, by the way, we invested billions of dollars into understanding how to do. And then these people, right, bowing to that mis and disinformation, then propose legislation to ban those things based on just like mob efforts fueled by disinformation. And you want public officials who are able, both ideally, to explain to the public, but also just to stand up for like basic truth. These tools saved millions of lives, millions of lives. And the idea that somehow you're going to make them illegal because of some disinformation that confuses the fundamental biology at play, I just think is really dangerous. And look, I mean, the thing about it is this, is that I know that somebody listening to this could be like, oh, well, you can't blame people for what they're afraid of. Well, you can blame people who deliberately stoke fear, A, and B, what you have to do in the face of misinformed fear is explain, not back down and just do as people are telling you to do when it's not in their best interest or yours. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, or just for political points, right? Like, this is doing so much damage that even if these bills don't go through, right? The weapons of mass destruction is ridiculous. That's not going to go through. But like, it makes a headline, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it increase it just makes me
It
mad. But you're
it
right.
drives the Overton window. You're right, it does. And it
Yeah,
communicates on its own, it communicates that this is something that ought to be
questioned.
that people ought to be questioning or afraid of. And this is the thing, right? It's like when it comes to vaccines, the lift is a lot harder for people who promote them because you're asking people to do a thing. And whenever there's fear, it's going to bias people against doing the thing. And in this case, doing that thing is good for them and it's good for all of us. And so, it's just this is a sign of our times. And right now, you've literally got folks who have been some of the chief disinformers leveraging their position in government to drive this disinformation and to validate it. And it's really dangerous. America Dissected is brought to you by the de Beaumont Foundation. For 25 years, the de Beaumont Foundation has worked to create practical solutions that improve the health of communities across the country. The foundation advances policy, builds partnerships, and strengthens systems to give everyone the opportunity to achieve their best possible health. To learn more, visit debeaumont.org. I want to move because we saw the NIH make a huge investment to develop a universal flu vaccine. And, we would support that. That's a great thing to do. But a lot of folks in the scientific community are a little bit concerned about this. Katelyn, can you tell us a little bit about why?
Yeah, so this does not have to do with mRNA vaccines, right? So what they're funding is this 100-year-old vaccine technology where we basically deactivate a whole virus, put it into a vaccine vial so our immune system can learn that that virus is bad. And this is actually one of that Fauci, while at NIH, really supported. And we use this with a lot of vaccines. For example, whooping cough, right? Our whooping cough vaccine, at least the first generation, was incredibly effective. The challenge is that this old vaccine technology has a lot of limitations and potential problems. So, for example, the whole inactivated vaccine, like I said, does a really good job at generating immune response. It's very effective. But the problem is that people get more side effects. So, fevers, feeling really crappy for a few days. So, with whooping cough, we actually moved to a different version of the vaccine in the 90s, which is much milder in terms of its side effects profile, basically. One of the goals in this announcement was that we are moving towards or wanting to find a universal vaccine for like flu or COVID that's variant proof. And that would mean, honestly, no longer we have to keep updating our vaccines and making predictions about what strains are coming down the pipeline for flu, which may mean we wouldn't have to have boosters every year, which is pretty amazing, honestly. I think it would be really great. It's really, really hard to do, to make one of these universal vaccines. Some candidates have gotten to clinical trials, and these clinical trials have just failed. And so I don't think that the problem is that we're looking into this biotechnology for vaccines. I think the part where I have an issue is that we're putting all of our eggs in a basket. There was no level of review about where this $500 million is going to, what this one lab is really going to do. And I'm a little concerned also of conflict of interest of who is this guy. He's been working in the Trump administration and has a lot of incentive to get this 500 million personally as well to pursue this technology. So yeah, we'll see where this goes, but I'm not convinced that it really will spring us forward into a new generation of vaccines, but I guess we'll see. What do you think, Abdul?
Yeah, I can't help but go back to that waste, fraud, and abuse question, which is, usually in science, what you do is you let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? You, instead of one $500 million grant, you do 100 $5 million grants. And let's be clear, a $5 million grant can fund a lab for like 2 years, right? And then if the lab research is promising based on a track record of demonstrated leadership and success on your hypotheses, then you fund more money over time. This idea of trying to identify one silver bullet is just not consistent with the way science works. And then when you throw in the conflicts of interest here, it opens up a question of like, okay, so why are you giving all this money to one lab, right? And what happens if that science just doesn't go anywhere, right? Like, and that's the thing is like, I'm perfectly open to the idea that this might work. This would be great. Fantastic. I'm just wondering why we think this is the only idea that might work. Why we're not interested in sort of spreading around multiple hypotheses. And while at the same time, we're trying to ban one really successful, vaccine platform, and then you're putting all your eggs in this other vaccine platform at the same time. That to me just seems a little bit concerning.
Because I think it is concerning, Abdul. But this next story is also, I think, equally, if not more concerning. And it got buried in the news last week, but it's really important to talk about. Last week, several major medical journals received threatening letters from a very powerful Trump surrogate. Abdul, what do we know about this?
Yeah, so these were letters sent from the interim U.S. attorney in Washington, whose name is Ed Martin, who's a conservative activist who has been a deep MAGA backer in the past. And according to the New York Times, the letters accuse the journals of being, quote, partisans in various scientific debates. The letters include accusatory questions to the editors that ask, if they accept submissions from scientists with competing viewpoints, how they handle previously published articles, if they find out that authors may have misled their readers, if they're transparent about influence from supporters, funders, and advertisers, right? And some of the biggest journals have gotten targeted. New England Journal of Medicine, 3 other scientific journals confirmed they received the letters, and there might be more. And the thing about these letters that I think folks have to understand is, these are like private peer-reviewed journals. They're literally the most important medium for publishing scientific information. And so when they're accusing them of being, quote, partisans, what they're trying to make them into is partisans. Right? So when the Trump administration calls you a partisan, they're saying, you're not like me. That's what they're basically trying to say. And if you're not like me, then we're going to weaponize government potentially against you. And if you're getting letters from a U.S. attorney, that comes with a level of threat that is implicit in who's signing the letter. And so for all of us who believe in free and open and transparent science, it's impossible not to connect all of the things that RFK is trying to do at HHS with threatening literally the vessels of scientific discourse at the same time. And if you believe in science, you have to believe in transparency. But if you're intimidating the very vessels where that transparency is supposed to sit, that becomes really, really dangerous for the free flow of science as it stands. Katelyn, what do you make of it?
Yeah, and they clearly just don't know how medical research is done. If they're asking to be transparent about influence, about funders, or conflicts of interest. Do you know how many questions we have to answer when we're submitting a journal article to the New England Journal of Medicine around the conflicts of interest and who we've been funded and grants and whether it's I mean, it is probably one of the best methods out there for being very transparent. That doesn't mean that people in industry don't get to publish. And I actually agree with that, but they have to be very transparent. And it is obvious when you just open up a New England Journal of Medicine article, who funded it, what the authors, where they're from, and the peer-reviewed process is incredibly stringent as well. I know as scientists usually get really frustrated with the peer-reviewed process, but like every time it's gone through it, my science has gotten better, not worse because of it. And I think that they just truly just don't understand. And like you said, are likely wanting to sow doubt. I mean, I think that is the theme across all of these. These they're going to be protected by First Amendment too, right, Abdul? Like it's just theater, right?
I mean, that's the thing, right? It's like if they were serious, they would actually take them to court where they would lose.
Yeah.
But this isn't about taking them to court. This is about the threat of litigation. And that's the thing, right? It's like people don't appreciate that, like lawfare, when the way it works isn't necessarily that you will lose in court. It's that they will force you into spending huge amounts of legal fees that will ultimately bankrupt you before you ever get to court, right? That's the trick here. That's what they understand themselves to be doing because they know they'd lose in court on that front. The other point that you brought up, Katelyn, which I really appreciated, is that all of our conflict of interest work is about financial conflicts of interest. But what this administration has done is it's changing the way that they want people to think about conflicts of interest, as in corporations and others with a financial stake in the outcome of science aren't really that bad. That's what they want you to think. They want you to think that it's a partisan viewpoint, right, and an ideological spin on science. So, if the New England Journal of Medicine has ever published a piece on disparities, they want to make an argument that, disparities aren't a problem on their own terms, but that they're being driven through some partisan lens to be made an issue, right? And so they're taking that whole idea of what a conflict of interest really is and trying to turn it on its head in a really dangerous way. And then the last point is anybody who's ever published a paper knows that the peer review process is quite painful. It's always reviewer 3 who like decides to show up one day and like they wake up in the morning and choose violence, right? And this goes through a really rigorous process, which, by the way, my issue with peer review, it's not that it's not transparent, which it could always be more transparent. I'd like to know who are the reviewers, at least after the paper is published, and where they come from. It's just that it's slow, right? And that, that has been a real issue in the past. And, that's not to say that there aren't issues with the way that a lot of these journals run, right? I mean, I think the idea that you don't have open source medical journals in 2025, that they're making all this money off of free peer review labor is a problem. But like the idea that somehow they're like partisans is not it. And here you have the government weaponizing its imprimatur to try and make that argument.
Yeah, I think, Abdul and you and I seem to be very aligned with this, that like this process could be better, but that's not what they're talking about here. Not even close. So we'll see. And then at the same time of all of this, right, we are in the middle of this measles outbreak. We are now at more than 900 confirmed cases. I think we're going to reach very soon 1,200 cases, which would mean the record number of cases over the past 25 years. And RFK Jr. is once again really speaking out of both sides of his mouth. Last week, he went on the Dr.phil show, and I think it's really important to hear what he has to say. We're going to play 2 different parts of that interview. Take a listen.
If you want to avoid measles, and if you want to avoid spreading measles, the best thing you can do is take that vaccine. Right. I would say that we live in a democracy, and part of the responsibility of being a parent is to do your own research. You research the baby stroller, you research the foods that they're getting, and you need to research the medicines that they're taking as well.
So this do your own research has become a slogan basically around anything science-based. And I get that people want nuance, and I actually support empowering people to understand science a lot like we have with what he says is baby strollers, or when I'm shopping for a car and looking at consumer insights, for example. The challenge is, though, that when we say do your own research without the tools or the knowledge or the roadmap on how to do that, it really leads people down conspiracy rabbit holes. And it comes, I'm always reminded of this idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where really uninformed people sometimes think they're incredibly smart, and well-informed people, like I would say myself, always think I'm very dumb because I am always thinking about what I don't know and how I'm not approaching a conversation. And so this whole do your own research is really quite troubling for something like vaccines or drugs that are incredibly complex and hard to do if you haven't been trained in it for 8-10 years. What do you think, Abdul?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And then the other problem with do your own research is that there is a hierarchy to information. And too often we as a society have failed to introduce that hierarchy to people in ways that make sense. And so what happens is they get the least common denominator information, which opens the floor for mis and disinformers to just create all kinds of noise that make it harder for people to see the signal. And so when folks, quote unquote, do their own research, what are they going to find? They're going to find all that mis and disinformation that folks who have an ideological spin or a dollar to make off of that mis and disinformation put out there. And so I worry, right, that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, yes, do your own research, but we're not actually going to teach you how to do that research. And we're going to make sure that all you find is stuff that aligns ideologically with what we want you to see. And that just becomes a never-ending downward spiral into the worst kind of mis and disinformation ecosystem. And your point about Dunning-Kruger is exactly right? That, when you know a little bit about something, you think you know it a lot. I think both you and I have mentored PhD students. And I remember when I used to mentor PhD students, I would know that they were ready to defend their dissertation when you would ask them a question you knew they didn't know the answer to, and they would say, I don't know. And that shows a level of comfort with both what you know and then a knowledge of how much more there is to know and an understanding of what the bounds of your knowledge really are. And that's the thing, is that like and humility to actually speak on what you actually know. And that's the thing, is like, the more you learn that there is to learn, right? And that's actually the hardest part about learning. It makes you feel like you know less because the universe of all there is to know feels so much bigger, and it grows faster than what you can actually learn and assimilate yourself. And, they rely on this effect to make people think that like expertise can be picked up by watching a couple of reels or some TikToks. And that's just not how expertise works, unfortunately. And look, we live in a society where we increasingly have less and less respect for expertise. And the part of the problem, right, is that there is a unsaid theme in our moment, which is that expertise is about elitism. And too often, my frustration with experts is that we have often coded it as elitism. And that's part of the problem. Yeah. And I think there's also a message here to all of us, which is to say, your responsibility with your knowledge is humility enough to recognize that you have a responsibility to speak on what you know and not what you don't know, but also to engage and present it in ways that empower people to know something rather than to hold it over them, right? And sometimes our response to mis and disinformation is to sneer at people who don't know as much as we do, rather than to have empathy for that position and to seek to educate in a patient and humble kind of way. And I think, in some respects, we've I hate to say it, but like we've somewhat ceded the space for circus clowns like RFK.
Preach it, Abdul. Yes, you're right. I also, we're behind on this, right? Like, I truly think we could do better. We can create tools for people to help them rank different studies if they want to read an abstract, or walk them through of how we think about this and why we think this study is better than another study. That's just something that is a culture change within science, honestly. And I say this often when I'm talking to big conferences that, I get death threats and whatever from my newsletter, but what hurts the most is thousands of paper cuts from colleagues that don't understand the value of breaking down and translating science for everyday use. And so this is really, I know it's easy to point fingers and yell and scream at RFK, but at the same time, we also need to look internally to see how we can do better too. There's truly a curiosity driven class out there that has been unleashed, and we need to meet the moment.
And may I say, for folks who want really thoughtful breakdowns of a lot of these questions, there's this great Substack. It's called Your Local Epidemiologist, written by this fantastic epidemiologist and generally lovely person who lives out in San Diego, which is like really the only thing I would hold against them. But otherwise, really fantastically done. And I highly recommend it. So I hope folks will check it out.
Yeah. And if you're in this space, we need more of these scientific translators out there too. So come on in the arena. It's fun.
America Dissected is brought to you by Quince. I'm the kind of guy who goes from sweater weather to just plain sweat. I don't love it. It's not something I'm proud of, but it also means I'm looking for great warm weather clothing, and in particular, shirts. Which is why I love me some Quince. Quince has all the things you actually want to wear, like organic cotton silk polos, European linen beach shorts, and comfortable pants that work for everything from backyard hangs to nice dinners. The best part? Everything with Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than what you'd find at similar brands. By working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middleman, Quince gives you luxury pieces without the crazy markups. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. I gotta tell you, those shirts, they fit like a glove in all of the best ways, but at the same time, I don't feel like I'm being sweltered by my own shirt. Elevate your closet with Quince. Go to quince.com/AD for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/AD to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/AD. So before we go, we do have some really interesting polling from Harvard, and let's. I love coming out of this last story to present a story about Harvard. All right, so we got some polling from Harvard. We're not going to hold it against them. They do good work. And the de Beaumont Foundation, which is, of course, a supporter of our podcast. And the research was led by Dr. Jillian Steelfisher, who we had on the show last month. And their team surveyed more than 3,000 Americans to ask about public health priorities and trust. And here's a couple of things that stood out to us. The survey found that there's a bipartisan support for several public health priorities. Like, it doesn't matter if you code right, code left, Republican, Democrat, like you generally agree on what the key goals of public health ought to be. Overwhelming majorities of Republicans and Democrats agree on the following public health issues that they should be top priorities of the CDC and state and local health departments over the next 4 years. Preventing chronic disease, 86% of Republicans and 91% of Democrats. Protecting against new viruses that could become pandemics, 75% of Republicans, 92% of Democrats. Reducing maternal and infant mortality, 81% of Republicans and 86% of Democrats. And ensuring the safety of tap water, 81% of Republicans and 85% of Democrats. But that's not to say that there is perfect consensus on all of these issues. The big issue that split Republicans and Democrats was the issue of trust in public health agencies over the next 4 years. Nearly 3/4 of Democrats said they'll lose trust in public health over the next 4 years. 57% of Republicans said they'll gain trust in public health. 4 in 5 Republicans believe that the CDC will function better with new leadership at HHS, while 4 in 5 of Democrats believe it will function worse. So a lot of agreement on what needs to be addressed, a lot of disagreements about who needs to address it. Katelyn, what do you make of these findings?
Yeah, first of all, it warms my heart that all Americans want us to focus on health. I think that's a good starting point here. What is hard for me to reconcile is, obviously we see solutions as differently depending on what side of the aisle you're at. Like what to do about chronic disease, what to do about bird flu, for example. But I'm having a really hard time reconciling that destructing our public health infrastructure and providing it less resources is going to allow us to fight more chronic diseases or fight more bird flu. I wanted more deeply into this than the survey provided, but to really ask Republicans, but I guess more MAGA, of like, how are we going to achieve this with less resources? And if we fail because there is less resources, is that going to decrease your trust in public health even more? I feel this as a really terrible negative feedback loop that I'm not entirely sure how to get out of.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like the point of resources are really important. But I think a lot of this also just goes back to the conversation we just had about trust in the scientific process, right? The big difference between previous iterations of HHS and RFK Jr. is not the identification of the problem. Like we agree generally on the problems. It's how you solve them. And we've been saying for a long time that we should be using the process of science, because the thing about science is that it always bends towards certainty, but not at the very beginning. Whereas with RFK Jr. and others, right, the entire Trump phenomenon is about projecting a level of certainty on things that you cannot be certain of, right? And I think that, I hate to say it, but like there is a level of like an authoritarian approach to things, which seems to give a level of confidence that for anybody who's thinking about how you actually ask and answer big questions seems ridiculous. But I can understand that if this seems like yet another thing you don't have access to, and some elite tells you that you should be trusting in and funding, that you'll say, yeah, like I don't actually even know what it is that you want me to believe in here. And I just think that suggests to us that we have a lot of work to do to inspire a level of confidence in the process of science, right? Because what we're basically saying is like this process always gets you to the right answer. We just don't start with any preconceived notions of what that answer is, like, which is fundamental here. And I think that ability to teach the process, to empower folks to understand the process and to own the process, I think is, to me, the coin of the realm. And if for all of us who want science to be a part of public health moving forward, we really got to get up and start explaining the process so much better than we have.
I agree. The process as well as proposed solutions, right? So a lot of these systems have been failing Americans. There's no doubt about that. And I've seen that with this groundswell. The challenge that I'm seeing right now, though, at least among Democrats, is defending the status quo, defending those old systems rather than pushing for alternative solutions than what RFK Jr. is doing, right? Provide an alternative pathway for people to follow that will fix these systems and will be more responsive to the needs on the ground. So I hope that soon, particularly us in public health, can start providing a different pathway forward and not just defending that status quo and getting on the offense, honestly, which is really hard to do when you're putting out fires. So, Abdul, that was a lot. Who did you interview this week?
I had a really great conversation with Astra Taylor and Lindsey Muniak at the Debt Collective. So, I think one thing all of us can probably agree with is it's insane that we have medical debt. Like that's a thing, that you should go into debt in this country because you got healthcare. And they recognize that the power to stand up to medical debt is the power to bring folks who are debtors together to unionize against the systems that create that debt. And so they've built a movement called the Debt Collective. And we wanted to understand their approach to thinking about public policy, some of the wins that they've had in Maryland. And it was a really, really great conversation. So I hope folks will stick around for it. Katelyn, as always, it was a privilege and an honor to share a conversation. And I think we've reached a very self-serving conclusion here, not for lack of trying, which we need more people to explain science to people, which, is, yes, I guess, good for us.
Absolutely. All right. Have a good week.
All right, friend. You too. America Dissected is brought to you by Our Big Shot, a new podcast series exploring one of the biggest achievements in human history, the worldwide effort of immunization. Hosted by friend of the pod, Dr. Seema Yasmin, Our Big Shot features accessible stories you won't want to miss. Too often, our conversations about vaccines feature tragedy, misinformation, and discord. But this podcast tells the story of something completely different. It's a celebration of the 154 million lives saved by the combined efforts of the human race. Dr. Yasmin, disease detective turned journalist, unravels the history of our struggle against disease and what that means for the future, and how we continue with the goal of eradicating disease. She has personal experience working worldwide with scientists, psychologists, communities, parents, and children with one mission: to wipe out disease. She brings her firsthand, clear-eyed experience through conversations from around the globe that both astound and inspire. This series does not shy away from examining the many issues around immunization development for both history and the present day, and uses both to ask us questions about what we want for the future of science, social media, and ourselves. I love the show because Dr. Yasmin brings this incredible spirit to the work. She's both a journalist and also a doctor who's worked on the front lines. That voice, that perspective, it's critical to understanding an issue like this one. So search for and subscribe to Our Big Shot, Wiping Out Disease on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. All right, can you introduce yourself at the tape?
My name is Astra Taylor. I am a writer and occasional documentary filmmaker, and I am a co-founder of the Debt Collective, which is an experimental union of debtors.
And I'm Lindsey Muniak. I am the lead medical debt organizer with the Debt Collective, which means I build power with debtors nationally to take on the healthcare system that traps us in debt. And we believe that people shouldn't have to go into debt to access basic public goods.
Would you look at that? So do we. I really appreciate you all making some time to join us today and looking forward to this conversation. One of the really powerful things that you all have alighted upon is that there are forms of debt that just simply shouldn't exist, right? And it is not until we address the systems that create the debt in the first place that we can think about that world. But of course, the people who are most affected by it have already been hit by that. So can you tell us a little bit, Astra, about the idea behind the Debt Collective and this sort of notion of being able to bring people together around the issue of their collective debt and take on the systems that put them there?
Yeah, thanks for that invitation. I mean, the Debt Collective is, as I said, an experimental union of debtors. The idea is that individually, our debts overwhelm us. They make us feel ashamed. We are struggling. But when we come together with others, then we can fight for changes. And we believe that these debts are a systemic problem and that systemic problems require systemic solutions. So we're not fixated on debt as an end in itself. Our point is that we're in debt because we are denied the means to live. We're denied the public services that we should be able to access. So we have medical debt in the United States because we do not have a system of single-payer healthcare. People are overwhelmed by student loans because there's not a system of free public college. People are putting up their groceries and their essentials on payday loans or credit cards because the minimum wage in this country is $7.25 an hour. So we're in debt by design. And so we take inspiration from the labor movement. We take inspiration from civil rights organizing, from tenant organizing to say, oh, is there something here? Can we, like so many movements before us, turn our insecurity, our shame, our, struggles into solidarity to demand change? So we think we can bring new constituencies into the fight on different issues, but on healthcare specifically, because it's going to take a lot of folks. So, healthcare workers have been organizing for a long time. People who are generally, in the Democratic coalition have been organizing for healthcare reform. And we think that, obviously patients have a role to play, but so do medical debtors, because medical debt is something that sticks to you after your interaction with the healthcare system. So our idea is that there's some strategic potential here and a way to kind of expand the coalition to fight for something that should be so basic, which is just the ability to get care when you're sick without having your financial life ruined.
Lindsey, I want to ask you, because you've been working as an organizer on the medical debt side. And, when I was director of Wayne County's Department of Health, Human and Veteran Services, one of our key goals was to erase medical debt for our 300,000 residents who held medical debt. We ranked 8th among all counties in the country in medical debt when we took that on. But one of the things that I think has been weaponized against people with debt is this idea of shame. That the reason you're in debt is because you made irresponsible decisions in your life, and well, you just gotta pay the consequences because you were so irresponsible. And I know, and you know, and all of us know, and I know most of our listeners know that when it comes to medical debt, that's like ridiculous. When it comes to most forms of debt, that's ridiculous. But when it comes to medical debt in particular, right, it is absurd to think because, of course, the minute you step into the system because something's not feeling right, the monetization process of our healthcare system begins. And oftentimes you can't even opt out of it if you wanted to, so long as you don't have your own knowledge about how to care for yourself. So literally the minute you step in for that first diagnosis, you're captured. And if you don't have the means to pay, like you simply did the thing to try and protect you or a loved one from your medical debt. Can you walk us through how you talk to people in a moment when you're having an organizing conversation that gets them past that first hurdle of shame? And folks don't want to self-identify as somebody who holds debt because that's been the narrative in our society has made that such a shameful thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is really a question that gets at the core of what one of the things that we try to do at the Debt Collective, which is take this place where people are most alienated, where people feel frequently most alone, squeezed economically, reluctant to let their family members frequently know that they're struggling with debts that they can't pay because they're concerned about burdening those other people in their lives, their children, their partners, their parents, or even just feeling this sense that they've created a situation that they should have anticipated, that they should have been better prepared for, that really is something that they should feel guilt about. And so one of the ways that we like to bring people in past that initial reaction of shame, of guilt, that impulse to sort of like be very, very alone with your debt, is by bringing people actually into the same space as other debtors, right? And I'm here, Astra's here, we're both debtors ourselves. I had health crises in my 20s that meant that I racked up about $24,000 in credit card debt, paying for medical bills with a credit card. At this point, I know not to do that, but talking to people from the position of someone who's also indebted, who's also known that kind of squeeze in many ways, like most of us still know it, even if we've navigated certain student loan relief programs or not, but talking with people from that place and starting out by sort of saying, look, this is a system that is designed to make you feel like you've done something wrong. You haven't done anything wrong. You've sought healthcare when you were sick. And the fact that you now have these bills rolling in, these debt collectors calling, sometimes these threats of wage garnishments, lawsuits, like this is not something that you should feel ashamed of or embarrassed by. This is something that the system really should be embarrassed by. It's a failure of our institutions. It's a failure of our state to guarantee people's basic needs. And I think it's really important to sort of like help people redirect the understanding of where the quote unquote guilt lies in this situation. I mean, this is something I have a background in labor organizing. Astra mentioned that we borrow some things from the labor movement. One of the things that you do when you're trying to organize workers is sort of help them understand that their frustrations at work aren't the fault of their coworkers. They're not just some sort of like amorphous series of constraints that they're bound by, that actually, if they look up the chain of management, they can see places where people are making decisions that are hurting them. And we do something similar with debtors, right? Is sort of help people tease out where in the decision-making process of our institutions, of our government, this decision is made, or series of decisions, really, as we all understand, I think, that produces the situation that traps them in debt, that often for people who aren't in debt just creates an intense fear around even approaching the healthcare system, which of course, when people postpone care, their illnesses worsen, or things that would be treatable become untreatable or advanced acute conditions. And so really, we try to kind of build in some political education into the very kind of process of connecting with someone who's in debt, someone who's struggling with a bill they can't pay. And ideally, at some point very early in our encounters with debtors, we'll also connect them with other people who are navigating similar situations to help underscore that they aren't alone.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting, and this is taking a page from the anarchist anthropologist David Graeber, who was one of our dear allies in the very beginnings of the Debt Collective. He's since passed away, but he would always point out that in other languages, for example, in German, the word for debt literally means guilt or shame. So those associations run really, really deep. So, one simple thing we do at the Debt Collective is just try to challenge the language we use. So we never speak of debt forgiveness. We always speak of debt cancellation, debt relief, debt abolition, because we don't want to reinforce that phony morality that says you did something wrong when in fact it's the system that's broken.
Yeah. And one of the ways that the system is broken is that it hides behind a number of labyrinthine technical ways in which debt can be moved and costs are incurred. And so a lot of folks who even approach the healthcare system trying to get care actually don't know how money moves in the system. And so they don't necessarily know how best to avoid debt and then also how to handle it if it comes and it hits them. And it's that like opacity of the whole system. You guys have done some work in Maryland in particular around trying to step into that morass to bring both clarity and also address the system. And I know, Lindsey, you led some of that. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you came to the policies you wanted to push and then what ultimately came of it.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to a fight that started, I think, 6 years ago now or so in Maryland, that originated as part of a fight against Johns Hopkins Hospital in particular, for their practices of systematically trapping patients in medical debt and then pursuing them quite aggressively in collections with lawsuits and so on. We were sort of brought to this fight by the fact that National Nurses United, the large nurses union, had uncovered Johns Hopkins medical debt lawsuit practices and the number of lawsuits that they were filing against some of Baltimore City's poorest residents, and then sort of teased out that data and looked across the state of Maryland, and started to look beyond Hopkins too, and saw this pattern of hospitals, which in Maryland, because of the unique healthcare financing system that we have, actually get additional government subsidies in order to provide care for low-income patients. But we saw that those subsidies weren't actually making their way back to the cost of patient care, and that patients who were clearly qualifying for what are called financial assistance programs, sometimes called charity care programs, basically healthcare financial support that the hospital covers for low-income patients, usually under a certain threshold of the federal poverty line, that they were finding themselves hit with lawsuits, that the hospitals were pursuing wage garnishments against them, putting liens on for the patients who in many cases the only wealth that they have is wealth that comes in the form of homes that they inherited from parents. As property prices go up, that's all a lot of people have. In Baltimore in particular, these hospitals were requesting liens on their homes. And so because so many of these patients were clearly entitled to this financial assistance, we took that as the site of where we wanted to sort of start the policy fight, ensuring that patients would be introduced to financial assistance options when debt collectors started to call, and ideally before debt collectors started to call, and coming at that absolutely horrifying, just like slew of lawsuits that we were seeing filed against patients, coming at that directly and trying to put a stop to it.
Well, I really appreciate you leading that fight, because I think what you've done here is to set a precedent, because if you can go after Hopkins for these kinds of practices, you can build out an approach where you have demonstrated a pathway for folks to take on some of the biggest providers who are engaging in, frankly, just disgusting behavior. I mean, people are coming to get healthcare at your institution thinking that they're coming for the best possible healthcare that they can. And now you're like garnishing their wages and trying to put liens on their homes. It's really just, it baffles one's sense of morality.
Every episode of Trade-Offs is grounded in rigorous research.
I don't think that the findings of this paper indicate that there are major clinical risks to patients.
Thoughtful conversations.
I also was thinking that a lot of the anger, while real, is somewhat misplaced.
And insights into what the latest in health policy means for you.
And every member of Congress should be asking questions on both sides of the aisle about, hey, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars. What are we getting for it?
We tell stories that cut through the noise, uncovering the data and personal stories that help you understand the stakes and the potential solutions to healthcare's toughest choices. Subscribe to Trade-Offs wherever you get your podcasts.
Astra, I want to jump to you here, because the other part of this is also just around medical debt erasure. And this has been a big focus for a lot of us. Obviously, we did this in the county, but your work is really about bringing debtors together to advocate for these kinds of policies. And the thing I want listeners to remember about this is that the price of medical debt is a completely arbitrary thing. Like these prices are negotiated as a function of a hospital trying to meet out its bottom line on a distribution of different insurers, and then coming up with numbers for uninsured folks, basically off the cuff. And then the other part of it is, once that gets charged, it's like they're in writing. And so that arbitrary value is now written on a piece of paper, and folks think they have to pay that whole thing. But the reality of it is that there's a whole market for debt. And so you can buy medical debt for pennies on the dollar, because the reality of it is that once it goes unpaid, the probability it ever gets paid is super low. But like on the back end of that going to a debt collector is somebody getting just completely hounded and abused over the fact that they have debt, so that somebody can try and make a buck off of this debt that they just bought. And it's not like they're like, oh, I bought this for like pennies on the dollar, so let me just charge you pennies on the dollar. They're trying to recoup the whole value of that debt to pay off all the other debt they just bought that they'll never be able to collect on. And that sets up this arbitrage opportunity for governments and nonprofits to be able to buy that debt for literally pennies on the dollar. And it's actually kind of astounding to me why more debt hasn't been bought up and erased. And I know you guys are working on that problem. I'd love to hear more about what you see the obstacles as being and how we bring people together around that problem.
Yeah. I mean, this relates to your point about opacity. So another saying of the debt collective is we're in the dark and in the red. And this goes across debt types. I mean, most people don't actually know who it is they owe money to or how exactly their debt is structured. And this is the case for people with student loans. I mean, the student lending system, even though in that case, the creditor is overwhelmingly the federal government, they have all these private loan servicers in there, confusing things, taking a cut, mismanaging the loan portfolio, frankly, because mismanagement leads to increased profits. With medical debt, it's even more confusing because there are a zillion providers, right? I mean, we owe debts to different healthcare services. I think it's also important to note that, something has flipped in recent years, and actually the majority of medical debt is held by people with insurance in this country. So insurance is not a safety net against owing medical debt. And you're still enmeshed in all of this confusion. So that opacity is part of this. And that was something that just blew my mind. So I'm going back 10 years or more, back to the days of Occupy Wall Street, when some of us formed a working group. We realized that we wanted to make debt more of an issue. And we became aware of the fact that actually the debts we were being hounded for, that actually they'd been sold off. So someone was calling us on the phone and saying, you owe your $500 from that emergency room visit you had or that ambulance trip. And it wasn't even the person who provided care. It was some vulture who had purchased our old bills for, as you said, pennies on the dollar on a shadowy, very unregulated secondary debt market. And so back in 2012, it was sort of a precursor to the debt collective. We launched something called the Rolling Jubilee, which was the first big initiative that bought and erased debt. And we began with medical debt precisely because we knew it would be the one that most enraged people's moral imaginations, right? I mean, it's the hardest debt to kind of shame the debtor about, even though the shame is still there. And so we actually went viral. It was the first time I'd ever heard of Reddit. We were on the front page of Reddit. We ended up raising far more money than we had wanted to. We wanted to raise $50,000 to erase $1 million of medical debt and kind of, spread light on this phenomenon. And we had promised publicly, we won't pay ourselves a penny. We will be fully transparent. We will reach all these ethical standards. Well, guess what? We ended up raising like $700,000, and then we spent years navigating the secondary debt market. And we ended up buying and erasing tens of millions of dollars of medical debts, but also debts from students who went to for-profit predatory colleges. So that launched a whole campaign where we've won billions and billions of dollars of relief from the federal government, organizing people. So there has always been a tension for us around, the fact that it's really important to raise awareness, and it's really important to help people where you can by canceling their debts. But we actually need to build power together as debtors to change the system at the political level, right? We cannot buy and erase our way out of this debt crisis, right? So that's a kind of charitable approach, buying and erasing people's debts. We want the solidarity approach of building power to change politics. Now, I think it's a two-step, and we do both, right? Sometimes we do mutual aid, we erase people's debts, but we want to bring them into a bigger movement aiming at political change. And so the Debt Collective sometimes looks a little bit askance at these big initiatives where, public governments are erasing debts, because there's, public, when you are not an activist, but you're actually a public official, there are other tools you can use that get more at the systemic issues. And what we need to do is cut off medical debt at the source. The other thing I'll say is that occasionally the debts being bought and canceled, not occasionally, but I think the majority of the times, actually in the majority of cases, those debts are probably illegal under existing charity care regulations. A lot of those debts probably shouldn't exist, because they were, poor patient who meet those federal income thresholds and are deserving of free or reduced cost care as they go to a nonprofit hospital. Those laws are not respected. Let's be real. And so essentially hospitals are getting to sell debts that they shouldn't have created to begin with. So I think it's great when I think, again, I cheer every moment when somebody gets a medical bill canceled. I cheer the awareness of a kind of, the immorality, the reprehensive nature of these debts. But we ultimately need to keep building that political pressure, because we know the solution. Medical debt doesn't exist in Canada. Medical debt doesn't exist in other industrialized democracies that have healthcare. So, let's stop nibbling around the edges, and let's just get this mess fixed.
Yeah. No, I certainly 100% agree. I think, the hard part is, at a state and local level, there's actually not as much you can do around some of these big structural pieces. I think at state level you can. At a local level, right, you kind of say, all right, what can we do for our local community? Can we build alternative methods for healthcare provision, FQHCs, et cetera? But the challenge sits at that state and federal level. And, as you all well know, I happen to have several opinions about what we should do to address it. And I do want to get there, right? Because at the end of the day, medical debt does not exist in other places, in large part because the idea of medical debt would be an anathema, because they've understood the simple moral truth that if you are in a situation where you need healthcare, you just need healthcare. And so you're literally signing away. You will do whatever it takes to get you or your child or your elder the care they need to stay alive. And that may mean signing away your financial future in a moment of duress, which is an impossible decision to have to make, and nobody should have to make it. And so these societies have decided to buy their communities out. I think the obvious solution here, and we talked a bit about this, to me is about addressing the fact that everybody should have accessible, affordable government health insurance, right, in the form of a Medicare for all, which is just a name for government giving you healthcare no matter what your circumstances are. And I just want to be clear about this, right? Like, government already bills 65% of all healthcare in America, right, through Medicare and Medicaid. We just leave the most lucrative part that could be subsidizing the rest of it to private health insurance. But there are other things. And Lindsey, I think you talked quite a bit about this, about the fact that, like, healthcare companies themselves, they are able to both take advantage of the kinds of moves that a for-profit entity would make, and then also take advantage of public subsidies as a nonprofit. What are some of the provider side regulations that you'd like to see that you think would help to address this problem at the federal level?
I mean, I think a big focus of ours over the last few years, and it sounds like your interest of yours as well, has been on the rapidly growing consolidation in the provider industry, the healthcare provider industry. The pace of consolidation of these health systems, hospitals, is really astounding. These are systems that, as you mentioned, are often like the largest employers, the largest private employers in the state. They're receiving, because the majority of these hospitals and health systems are nonprofits, they're receiving really enormous public subsidies in the form, of course, of nonprofit tax breaks, but also in other avenues that sort of are conditional on their nonprofit status. But the kind of expectations of what that nonprofit status involves are always a little bit fuzzy. And so I think one of the things that we, as we've watched in Western Pennsylvania, UPMC buy up the entire regional healthcare system functionally, and become not only the dominant provider but the dominant insurer, and exert all of these powers over patients and workers in the area to control wages, to control healthcare costs that I know we're familiar with. We want to see some actual fight from our regulators at the state level, AG offices, and also at the federal level. The Federal Trade Commission, Lena Khan's FTC, and their appetite for actually sort of bringing some of the teeth back into antitrust regulations was incredibly encouraging, and the interest that they had started to take in the healthcare system, and in particular in these nonprofit provider systems, and their growing sort of like pace of building these regional monopolies. We wanted to see more done on that front. In this moment, of course, we're like also looking at the current administration, the fact that like what you're talking about as what does exist in the form of a public healthcare system in the United States is under imminent attack, and trying to figure out how we can both keep pushing for like those regulatory muscles to come back at the state level, and also fight back against the attacks on Medicaid and Medicare, and toward what you're describing, a system of universal healthcare where nobody has to make these impossible decisions.
If I could just jump in too, adding to that, I mean, and kind of connecting what Lindsey just said to your point about how tough it can be on the local level. I'm actually in North Carolina, which is a deep red state. People were telling us democracy was dead in North Carolina before the rest of America fell. But nevertheless, even the Republicans in the state have gotten behind medical debt relief. And so there's some interesting, unlikely coalitions to be built. And so to my point that I don't think we have to buy the debt from these predatory local hospitals. In North Carolina, some citizen pressure and some really good old-fashioned investigative reporting showed how egregious the debt collection practices were in the state across different hospital networks. So very much like Johns Hopkins suing low-income patients, it's happening across the state here, with many people getting liens on their homes. Their generational wealth being stripped away. Of course, these were mostly low-income folks, Black and brown folks. And, the community, when it got wind of this, when it was exposed, was totally outraged. And so hospitals, I think 6 hospital networks have voluntarily said, okay, we're not going to sue patients anymore. We're going to stop doing this, and we're going to erase medical debt. And, it's not perfect, but I think it shows that there's a lot of room for citizen pressure at the local level against hospitals. And that's why they are a worthy target, because they do have some kind of moral claim that can still be made on them. Like, are you serious? Yeah. You're doing this to the people you're supposed to care for. The state also piloted something interesting where they were actually using, we finally came late to the game of Medicaid expansion. And so there was also some contingencies put on that and say, if you're going to take these increased funds, you actually have to stop being such a hideous debt collector. And so I think that just points to some some interesting tactics or strategies at the state and local level coming from a state that is otherwise, again, pretty Republican.
Another, I think, really important point to underscore when we're thinking about healthcare is the potential alliance between patients and healthcare workers. And of course, the lines are blurred here. Healthcare workers themselves are patients in various moments. We've seen some really horrifying practices and patterns of hospital systems actually trapping their often low-wage workers, healthcare service workers, in debt at their own employers' institutions, right? Where you have these low-wage service workers who are making far less than the labor that they do, seeking care at employers that in many cases they've been with for decades, feeling some real institutional loyalty that comes with that long a period of service. And then they're getting calls from the hospital that employs them saying, hey, you owe us this debt. And so there's this potential kind of like alliance that I think it's important for everyone to remember that they're not the ones taking in all the extra money. It's going to the administrators, to the healthcare executives, and to the trustees, and various companies.
And I really appreciate you highlighting that point, right? Because the unions have been on the front lines of fighting against this and for safer work. And then patient care conditions at a lot of these hospitals. And so I think unions of patients and unions of doctors, nurses, and service employees, I think, are absolutely critical. On that note, I want to thank you all for your work and for sharing more about it with us. Our guests today are Lindsey Muniak. She's an organizer with the Debt Collective, specifically focusing on medical debt, and Astra Taylor, who is an author and organizer, a sometimes documentary filmmaker, and co-founder of the Debt Collective. We really appreciate you all coming on, and also appreciate the Marguerite Casey Foundation for their support in helping put this together. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
That's it for today. You can find more content at our website, incisionmedia.co. Check out our shop at store.americadissected.com for our new America Dissected merch, including logo shirts, hoodies, and mugs. And don't miss our Vaccines Matter Science Works t-shirts. If you have guest recommendations for the show, send us an email at info@incisionmedia.co. You can follow or subscribe to America Dissected on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube at America Dissected. You can follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Abdul Al-Sayed, no dash. And make sure to subscribe to Katelyn's newsletter, Your Local Epidemiologist, which breaks down the latest scientific evidence for over 300,000 followers. Search for Your Local Epidemiologist on Substack. Links to all of our sponsors are available in the show notes. I really do hope you'll check them out and show them some love. They do make the show possible every single week. Finally, on your way out, don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, drop us a like or comment, and word of mouth still goes a long way. So look, if you know somebody who'd love to have a conversation about all things health, let them know where to go. America Dissected is a product of Incision Media. Our co-host is Dr. Katelyn Jetelina. Our producer is Andy Gardner-Bernstein. Video and audio editing by Nadine Malkonia. Our theme song is by Taka Suzawa and Alex Uguera. Sales and marketing by Joel Fowler and Nick Freeman at Big Little Media. Our executive producers are Tara Knight and me, Dr. Abdul Al-Sayed, your host. Thanks for listening. This show is for general information and entertainment purposes only. It's not intended to provide specific healthcare or medical advice and should not be construed as providing healthcare or medical advice. Please consult your own physician with any questions related to your own health.